Truth and Futility. I found a book once. It was charred and a little damp, but the writing was mostly legible. I strained with the letters for hours at a time when I could spare them, trying to recall the lessons my mother had imparted with such fervour. A few of the words were beyond my limited knowledge, but most of them I recognised once I sounded them out. It was a book of stories from long ago, fantastic tales of gods and beasts and heroes and tragedy. One tale in particular struck me hard in the chest, because it was like someone had watched me and then painted a fantastical portrait of my life onto the page. Appropriately, it was not a happy story. To begin my own tale, I would simply say that my early life was typical, as far as I know. I grew up in a small village with my parents and my two brothers. We tended a modest field where we grew yellow grains and grey beans. We didn't know much of what lay beyond the outer fence, except that it was dangerous. There were bad people beyond the outer fence. Sometimes we would have visitors from other villages, but even the ones we knew were watched carefully. Once, a solitary traveller passed through looking for shelter for the night, in exchange for news and tales. He was an old man, grizzled and hunched, but spoke with a keen brightness to his speech that was echoed in his pale blue eyes. The news interested my father, I think, and some of the other adults, but for me it was the tales that captured my imagination. His tone changed when he recited the words like a song, but spoken. It was an entirely different voice to the one that had imparted the banal events of the wider world a few moments before. He spoke of the dangers beyond the village, and how the burning had changed everything. Nobody truly knew what the world was like before the burning, not anymore. Stories were all we had left now. The storyteller wove a tale of great armies sweeping across the land, crushing all resistance and doing bloody war upon one another. This great conflict had given us tales of shining heroism and blackest cruelty, of tides of change ebbing and flowing, and of the individuals caught up in the chaos. He also spoke of how tales tell that the burning was the doing of great winged lizards, fire-breathing dragons that reduced the world to ash in their wake. He called such tales fanciful, with a knowing look to the adults in the room, but something in his voice told me there was more left unsaid. That was probably about a year ago. I remember because it was around midsummer, when the dusk became dawn with little or no darkness of night between. A short while after the storyteller had passed through the village, we discovered that there had indeed been more left unsaid. It began with a strange noise, on the edge of hearing, quite unlike anything any of us had heard before. It sounded most like metal scraping metal, but resonated as if it came from a deep hole. It had the strangest, fearful effect on those who heard it, as if we somehow knew what it signified. I still remember the gut-wrenching terror that gripped me when the sound came a second time, altogether closer and clearer than the first. I don't recall how I survived. Honestly, I try not to think about it, because my memories are a confused, wildly churning mass of flame and fear, of pain and desperation, of loss. A whole village, small and insignificant though it was, simply gone. Nothing but ash and smoke where once had stood my entire world and everything I knew within it. I drifted for some time after that, dazed and running on instincts I had barely needed before. I learned to lift rocks to find the insects beneath, and though I was always hungry, I never starved. I found wreckages that bore signs of having been repurposed since the burning, and yet other items that had clearly been left untouched since long before. I even found a small blade once, which I gave a new hilt and sharpened carefully on the rocks. It saved my life on several occasions. It was around the same time that I found my book, actually. Sometime later, about 40 days ago, I came upon a sight that was so familiar to me that I had to close my eyes and shake my head, hoping to separate memory from reality. Yet when I looked again, the village was still there. Not mine, of course, but one so similar that I half expected to see my father's broad shoulders carrying the water out to the field which was as golden yellow as it was in my memories. I never knew anything so basic and so bleak as the existence I had led could look so idyllic through the eyes of a stranger. I was suddenly seized by a desperate need to impress upon them the dangers of the world, Nobody I had met believed in dragons, and I supposed that was because those who saw them with their own eyes tended to perish in the witnessing. I didn't care. I moved my blade to the front of my belt and approached the village slowly with arms wide, recalling the protocols of my home. I stood there for some time while they decided what to do, hoping they would let me in and would believe what I had to say. They did let me in. I ate a few morsels of their food which reminded me painfully of home, and offered what little news I had of the outside world. Then I warned them about the dragons. I don't know which reactions pained me more, the exasperated rolling of eyes, the mocking glances exchanged between villagers, or the heartfelt pity I saw in the eyes of one woman. Not a soul believed my words, and while some were simply dismissive, others were outright hostile, accusing me of fear-mongering, of scaring the children. I had worn out my welcome, and I moved on. That night, which I spent in the lee of a rock on the nearby hill, was short and brutal. As if summoned by my warnings, the terrible screeching cries rang out once more from the horizon, and the beating of monstrous wings thrummed through the humid night air. The village burned, and I cowered in abject, frozen terror, watching, unable to look away at first. When I finally did wrench my streaming eyes from the scene, the distant screams still floated up to my refuge, begging me for the help I could not give. I checked for survivors, of course, once the sun was high and the dragons a distant, horrifying memory. There were none. So far, I am the only person I know of to have survived an attack like this. Except, perhaps, the old storyteller. I met him again, somewhere in the trackless wastes, miles from anywhere. I told him my story, and he believed me. I saw it in his eyes. He listened with sad empathy when I told him about the village I failed to save, but there was no surprise in his expression. "What did you think they would do?" he asked. "Uproot their lives and run from the only home they have ever known, out into a hostile world, fleeing an unknown threat on the word of a stranger?" The storyteller smiled, pushing my book of fables back into my hands. "They might have thought you insane, Cassie, but you're not cursed. It's the world itself that is cursed. You're simply one of the few who know the truth of it."